Hello, and welcome to Starbound. My name is I Am Duck, and I'll be your narrator. If you enjoy human-created HFY stories and want to support us, we're on Patreon now. You'll also get access to exclusive stories you won't hear anywhere else. Link is in the description. Now let's get into it. The benthic star slammed into the alien ocean, the impact vibrating straight through Sutton Holden's boots into his jaw. Primary sensory arrays tore from the hull, shedding titanium. Inside the command cabin, the white illumination snapped off. Crimson emergency strobes flared. The multi-species survey vessel skipped across a wave trough, spinning, then impacted a second time. Deceleration slammed Sutton against his crash webbing, driving the oxygen from his chest. He hung suspended, heavy field boots pointed at cracked ceiling panels, while the inertial dampeners whined and popped. Freezing saltwater hammered the reinforced viewport. The fluid roared, a continuous drone of pressure against metal. Sutton blinked against the spinning cabin. Red strobes caught floating debris. A loose ledger panel clipped his shoulder. He forced a breath in and out, and swallowed the copper grit pooling at the back of his throat. Blythe. Sutton rasped over the internal comms. He swallowed again, raising his voice. Report lower deck. Status. Static popped in his right earpiece, followed by a wet cough. Blythe Tallis, the flight engineer, spoke with a voice scraped raw. I function, she said, breath hitching. The ship fares worse. We pitch at 24 degrees. The lower bulkheads. Sutton unlatched his chest restraints, dropping to the slanted floor plates and bending his knees to catch his weight. Did they seal? Manual overrides jam. Keys clacked over the comms. Port side corridors warped. On impact. Saltwater floods, ventral engineering. If that brine hits the primary battery banks, the arc will fry us. Trigger the auxiliary explosive bolts and doors 2 through 5 from your console. With the gravity generators offline, the ship listed hard to starboard. Sutton scrambled up the angled deck, grabbing the navigation table's edge to haul himself toward the command console. He hooked his boots under the desk's lip for leverage and swiped the cracked glass interface. Doors 2 through 5, he repeated, tapping the red override icons. Arming. Detonating. Subdeck thuds vibrated through his boots. Bulkhead sealed, Blythe said. Water contained. Battery banks clear. Give me 8 minutes to route power to the tertiary life support. Hands off the remaining controls, Sutton. Understood. Sutton wiped the condensation from his forehead with the back of his wrist. His jumpsuit clung to his skin, chilled by the moisture pooling in the dropping temperature. He pushed off the console, turning to check the aft cabin. The vessel stabilized, pitching back and forth on the swells. Sutton unbuckled his secondary harness and crossed the sloped floor to the rear bank of shock seats. The 2 Deviri crew members sat, locked in statuesque rigidity. Churin, the chief science officer, pressed his heavy charcoal hide deep into his restraints. His thermal sensory pits, typically a steady azure, flared bright white. Next to him, Nemi, the junior cartographer, displayed the same paralysis. The silver fractal patterns on her cranial ridges stark against her taut skin. Both officers stared straight ahead through the viewport at the churning water. Sutton approached. Deviri biology evolved for high-gravity environments. Their immense bone mass turned them into anchors the moment they touched liquid. Churin, Sutton pressed a hand to the bulkhead near the officer's seat. Report injuries. Nemi, tapped the console. Nemi remained frozen, pits locked on the water. Churin turned his head, the motion rigid and halting. Our lives end here, Sutton. Holden. We float, Sutton said. Bulkheads hold. Blythe has the power routing. You misjudge the tide, Churin replied, syllables clipped and sharp. Our mass dictates a vertical plummet to the seafloor. Once we settle, the stasis reflex locks our limbs, and our slow metabolisms drag the dying out into awareness. We remain pinned, conscious, and unable to rise. The ocean executes us all. We await the breach. The Deviri revered open water as a relentless enemy. Their mythology treated sinking beneath the surface as an ultimate doom. I will keep this vessel buoyant, Sutton said, locking his jaw. He felt his pulse hammering against his rib, recalling the zero-gravity coolant fluid from a past cycle, the sting of freezing fluid in his lungs. I outlasted a flooded reactor. We will survive this ocean. Turin looked back toward the viewport, where waves slapped the reinforced glass. Statistics render optimism irrelevant. The fluid claims its due. The aft bulkhead ground open, metal screeching on its tracks. Blythe Tallis pulled herself into the command cabin, black grease stripping her cheeks. She wore her jumpsuit sleeves rolled to the elbows, revealing layers of old weld burns and fresh purple contusions. She gripped a cracked diagnostic tablet. The primary intake valves ingested 14,000 litres of seawater before the crash protocols engaged, Blythe said. She crossed to the navigation terminal and dropped the tablet into the console. The engine's flooded. We hold our current position. Sutton stepped beside her, checking the fractured screen. The communication arrays. Do we have a signal to the orbital relay? Blythe tapped the screen, pulling up atmospheric sensor data. The impact pushed us into a localized weather cell. The lower atmosphere churns with airborne crystalline spray. Friction across those suspended particulates generates a continuous electrical interference field. Sutton tracked the scrolling data, tracing a dense ceiling of charged energy hovering over the waves, a piezoelectric squall blocking the transmission. The interference scatters all frequencies, Blythe said. Our distress ping bounces off the cloud floor and scatters. No outward transmissions. Atmospheric layer elevation? Sutton asked. 3.2 kilometers, Blythe replied. We must physically elevate the main transmitter buoy above the clouds for a clean ping. Without main thrusters, the ship stays down. Turin stared straight ahead. Ascension requires thrust. We lack. Communication stays local. Rescue remains orbital. The sea claims us. Blythe set her jaw, a grease smudge stuck against her pale skin. She met mechanical failure with aggression. Listen to me, Chief. Your evolutionary psychology dictates your reaction, but I dictate mine. My shipyard master taught that a downed vessel requires aggressive plumbing. We will launch the buoy. A klaxon burst through the cabin, a staggered, high-pitched wail. Sutton pivoted toward the port side viewport. A high-pressure stream of freezing saltwater hissed through micro-fractures in the mounting seal striking the deck plates. Seal buckling, Blythe said, snatching a scanner and moving to the glass. Exterior pressure bowed the thick titanium frame. Impact sheared the exterior retaining bolts. Sutton crossed to the re-emergency locker, yanked the door, and extracted a pressurized canister of expanding polymer and a titanium pry bar. He returned to the viewport. He jammed the nozzle against the leaking seam and squeezed. Grey polymer blasted into the cracks, reacting with the atmosphere and curling into a solid mass. The spray ceased. Temporary, Blythe said. Hairline fractures formed in the fresh foam as exterior pressure pushed inward. The frame flexes. You must anchor the compound from the exterior hull to press the seal outward. Sutton watched the spiderweb fractures multiply. He looked at his hands, noting a tremor vibrating through his knuckles. I need an outside line, he said. Turin unbuckled his restraints, his bulk rising to block the path to the airlock door. His thermal pits pulsed rapidly. Remain in the cabin, Turin ordered, lowering his tone an octave. The current possesses sufficient force to drag you downward. A villing exit ensures destruction. My species possesses buoyancy, Sutton replied, meeting the glowing azure pits. He read the physiological spike in the Deviri's posture. I displace water. I swim. Your mass proves insufficient against the surge, Turin countered. I use the displacement to my advantage. Sutton stated, gripping the polymer canister. He stepped around the officer toward the dorsal airlock. I must reseat the seal from the outside, or the glass shatters and the sea claims the cab. Sutton secured the dorsal airlock's inner door. Inside the cylindrical chamber, he stripped off his outer jumpsuit, retaining the insulated thermal layer. He strapped the polymer canister to his thigh and clipped a heavy safety tether to his waist belt. He pressed his forehead against the outer hatch. The zero-gravity coolant fluid memory resurfaced, freezing fluid rushing the engine bay, lungs seizing against the chill. He forced the image away, mapping his immediate route to the viewport instead. "Sutton," Blythe said through his earpiece. "Cabin pressure drops. The patch crumbles. Egress now." "Cycling the chamber," Sutton said, striking the manual release lever. The outer door parted. Seawater surged into the space, the kinetic wall throwing Sutton backward into the inner bulkhead. The chill bit through his thermal layer, locking his joints. He opened his mouth, catching a rush of brine on his tongue. He snapped his jaw shut, clamping his lips. He tracked his pulse, forcing his limbs to uncoil against the thermal shock. Sutton opened his eyes. He kicked his legs, sweeping his arms in a broad breaststroke. The displacement generated thrust, pushing him through the airlock hatch and into the open swell. Towering waves rolled overhead, obscuring the dim sky, while dark water dropped away beneath his boots. Sutton grabbed the benthic star's exterior hull railing, pulling himself hand over hand across the plating against the current. He reached the portside viewport. Inside, Nemi stood pressed against the glass, her thermal pits widened to maximum aperture. Tracking the human she calculated would plummet to the ocean floor. Sutton maintained his position outside the window. With a steady flutter kick, Sutton countered the tide. He unhooked the polymer canister and wedged his boots into exterior sensor divots for leverage. Aiming the nozzle at the buckled frame, he sprayed a continuous bead of expanding compound into the exterior seams. The foam cured in the salt water, gripping the titanium and pressing it tight against the hull. Inside, Nemi pointed over his shoulder. A half-dozen silver-ridged aquatic organisms darted around his legs. Elongated fins propelled them through the turbulent medium. They circled the human, investigating the new shape in their territory. Through the glass, Nemi tracked the organisms, logging the presence of a thriving ecosystem in what Deviri law defined as a wasteland. Sutton finished the seal. The titanium held flush against the plating. He met Nemi's sensory pits, raised his thumb and kicked his legs, stroking back toward the dorsal airlock. The airlock pumps roared, purging the liquid. The inner door slid open. Sutton dropped onto the command deck, water streaming from his gear. Tremors racked his shoulders. He peeled the wet hood back and hauled the cabin air into his lungs. Blythe knelt beside him, draping an emergency foil blanket over his shoulders. She unclipped the empty canister and set it on the deck. "Whew, seal holds," she said, the corner of her mouth lifting. Sutton pulled the foil tight. Churin looked down at him. The Deviri commander lowered himself to a single knee, bringing his glowing pits level with Sutton's face. "I monitored your maneuvers," Churin said, lowering his volume. "My archives are quite liquid planets with structural collapse. Our history logs a total fatality rate from open immersion. You entered the fluid." Churin tracked a drop of water sliding off Sutton's collar. "You manipulated the medium to rise. Your actions revise our base assumptions." Sutton clattered his teeth together, forcing a grin. "Physics, Churin. Displacement and buoyancy. It demands psychological adaptation," Nemi added, stepping forward. "Your heart rate accelerated on the medical monitor, indicating thermal shock. Yet you completed the repair. I observed indigenous organisms navigating the currents. You mirrored their mobility. The phobia represents a strictly Deviri limitation." "Save the species analysis," Blythe said, crossing deck to the navigation panel. She grabbed a piece of salvaged plating and grease pencil. "Sutton secured the hull. We stay afloat. We still need to punch the transmitter buoy through the piezoelectric squall." Sutton stood, bracing his shoulder against the bulkhead. Main thrusters remain offline. Our kinetic launch mechanisms lie in ruins. Conventional mechanisms, yes, Blythe corrected. She sketched a schematic on the metal plating with the grease pencil. We have a functional reactor, unlimited salt water, and a cylindrical main exhaust tube. We construct a steam cannon. Saturn approached the table, tracking her lines. A steam cannon. Affirmative. Blythe tapped the plating. The reactor utilizes a titanium cooling jacket. Currently, the core sits dormant. We detach the communications buoy from the dorsal housing, then load it into the main thruster exhaust tube. Turin leaned over the table. Identifies a source for this payload. We siphon seawater into the reactor's cooling jacket, Blythe said. We seal the intake, then ignite the fusion cycle. The core flash boils the trapped liquid. Water expands into steam at a ratio of 1 to 1600. The exterior pressure builds. I route a manual release valve from the cooling shell to the exhaust tube. Upon reaching maximum PSI, we open the valve. The expansion fires the payload through the interference field. Saturn dragged a hand over his jaw. The kinetic recoil guarantees structural damage to the lower hull. If the release mechanism jams, the reactor shell detonates. I log the risk probability, Blythe said. The alternatives are slow asphyxiation or aggressive plumbing. I proceed with the plumbing. The hull stress fractures guarantee fatal structural compromise, Turin said. Idle drifting guarantees suffocation, Blythe stated, dropping the grease pencil. Chief, assist me with loading the buoy into the exhaust tube. Sarton, prep the reactor for a cold start. Sarton discarded the foil blanket. He flexed his hands to work the stiffness from his joints and descended the rear engineering access ladder. Inside the lower reactor bay, he aimed a handheld luminaire across the cylindrical core housing. He unlatched the primary ignition chamber's access panel and checked the internals. A jagged split bisected the synthetic quartz node. Blythe, Saturn said over the comms. Ignition relay shattered on impact. The synthetic node severed. The fusion cycle lacks a spark. Blythe exhaled sharply over the radio. Spares in the locker. Storage crate crushed, Saturn said, brushing his thumb over the fractured quartz. Relay destroyed. Nemi stepped to the navigation terminal. She punched a sequence into the cartography interface, pulling a localized seafloor sonar scan beneath the hull. Saturn, Nemi called out. You specified a piezoelectric ignition component, a material capable of generating a heavy electrical charge under mechanical stress. Affirmative, Saturn answered from the bay. The original component used a synthetic quartz compound. We need a high-yield piezoelectric substitute. Substitute located, Nemi said, tapping the screen. Sonar ping indicates a calcified ridge situated on an outcropping 32 meters below us. Energy readings confirm heavy crystalline electric properties. The reef functions as a biological electrical generator. Sutton climbed the ladder, checking the topographical map. That explains the squalls above us. Ocean currents are grinding this ridge into charged spray and seeding the storm with the same piezoelectric material. Extract a segment of this material, Nemi said, and Blythe replaces the relay. A blunt mechanical strike forces the bionode to discharge the necessary voltage. Blythe looked up from a schematic, meeting Saturn's eyes. Saturn checked the depth gauge. 32 meters down. The surface swim involved lateral movement against waves. A vertical descent required anchoring to a ruptured hull. The ambient pressure multiplied with every meter. I require a tether, Saturn said, crossing to the severed data cables hanging from the ceiling housing. A physical guideline. Saturn, Turin said. Your hand tremors increase. Your respiratory rate escalates. The deep fluid introduces pressure variables human biology resists. I log the variables, Saturn replied, pulling a bundle of fiber optic data lines free from the housing. He braided them together into heavy knots. The reactor needs a spark. I swim. Saturn stood in the dorsal airlock wearing a pressurized atmospheric suit salvaged from the locker. He locked a pneumatic kinetic chisel to his right wrist and secured the braided data cable to his utility belt. He tested the tension. Blythe anchored the opposite end at the console. Line secured, Blythe said over the comms. I serve as the anchor. You dive, chisel the material, And give the cord a double tug so I can engage the winch. Retrieve the node and return. Understood. Sutton pulled the spherical helmet over his head and locked the collar rings. He hit the manual release. The outer door retracted. The sea rushed in, but the suit's weighted boots dragged his center of gravity downward. He dropped past the airlock rim. Surface illumination faded. The pressure gauge on his wrist ticked upward, the suit joints groaning under the increasing atmospheric load. Sutton activated the twin shoulder-mounted luminaires, throwing dual beams through the silt. He sank past 12 meters, then 24. The ambient chill bled through the insulation. His lungs hitched, the coolant flood memory overlaying the current descent, the sensation of falling inside a sealed metal cylinder. He forced his jaws to unlock, speaking to hear his own voice. Passing 30 meters. Pressure holds, suit joints secure, scanning for the target ridge. He checked the area below his boots, where a blue radiance sharpened into a jagged ridge of calcified nodes, crisscrossed by thick, fibrous stalks of deep-water vegetation swaying in the current. Sutton struck the rocky outcropping, bending his knees to absorb the landing. He stood beside a protruding piezoelectric rock cluster. Target reached, Sutton reported, his voice tight from the compression on his ribs. Engaging chisel. He pressed the pneumatic chisel against the base of a node and triggered the burst. The bit hammered the dense rock, sending blue sparks showering into the silt. The kinetic strike released a localized electrical wave that shorted his right luminaire. The mineral snapped. Sutton grabbed the heavy chunk with his left hand, tearing a thick bundle of fibrous stalks loose as he pulled away from the ridge. Catalyst secured, Sutton said. His chemical monitor chimed, a tachycardia warning, in his earpiece. The compression burnt his chest. He grabbed the tether at his waist and yanked twice. Blythe, haul the line. The tether snapped taut, lifting his boots off the seafloor. He rose 12 meters, the glowing ridge fading below. The ascent halted with a sharp jolt. Sutton dropped back a half-meter, the harness biting into his ribs. The cord locked in place. Blythe. Sutton cycled his legs against the weight. Winch stopped. Status. I have tension on the line, Blythe responded, her voice tight. The cord caught on the torn undercarriage plating. I lack the leverage to break it free from the console. Sutton grabbed the tether above his helmet and hauled his weight upward. The line held fast against the twisted metal, leaving him suspended 20 meters down. The ambient pressure squeezed his joints. Sutton let his arms drop. He locked his right elbow over the fibrous stalks and gripped the glowing node in his left hand. His breathing shifted to shallow, rapid intakes. He stared into the water, his limbs locked against the chill and the weight. Inside the cabin, Turin checked the inner viewport. He traced the data cable running beneath the hull, then accessed the suit telemetry on the secondary monitor. Sutton's heart rate climbed past baseline. His muscular activity dropped to 0. Turin diagnosed the physiological stillness. He identified the paralysis of compression shock. The human who previously navigated the fluid layer now mirrored the De Vere response to open water. Turin examined his own heavy hands. De Vere historical records categorized the ocean floor as the ultimate cessation of movement. Sutton made the descent to retrieve the ignition component. Turin raised his head, his thermal pits flaring to a bright azure. He crossed into the dorsal airlock chamber. Turin, report your action, Blythe called from the command console, leaning a weight against the jammed cord. I extract the human, Turin said, stepping past the inner seal. Turin struck the control panel, sealing the inner door. He bypassed the cycling protocols and triggered the manual release for the outer hatch. The chamber flooded. The incoming tide's kinetic wave struck his chest. Unshielded by a pressurized suit, Turin utilized his dense physiology. The water rushed over his hide, breaking around his center of mass. He planted his boots on the metal grating and engaged the magnetic locks, anchoring his frame against the surge. He stepped onto the exterior hull. The cold struck his dermal layer. His genetics triggered the stasis reflex, prompting his joints to lock. He forced his jaw open, emitting a low-frequency vibration that resonated through the fluid. He pushed through the stasis reflex, extending his arms forward until he caught the taut data cable. Chirin wrapped his hands around the braided wire. He braced his boots against the torn titanium hull plating and hauled backward. His musculature, calibrated for high-gravity environments, leveraged his mass against the snag. The jagged piece of metal pinning the tether bent outward on its rivets. The cord slipped clear. Chirin maintained tension, drawing the line upward hand over hand. He pulled Sutton up to the hull, catching the heavy diving suit against his chest. Using his free arm, Chirin grabbed the airlock rim. He stepped backward into the chamber, carrying the human, and struck the emergency purge. The outer door sealed, the pumps engaged, draining the salt water. The inner hatch parted. Chirin left the data cable in the chamber, carried Sutton into the command cabin and set him on the deck plates. Blythe unlatched the helmet rings and pulled the dome clear, unsealing the collar. Sutton looked pale grey under the red strobes as he drew harsh, ragged breaths, pulling the cabin air into his lungs. Nemi knelt, pressing her hands to her shoulders. "Sutton Holden, you are aboard the vessel. The fluid remains exterior." Sutton blinked, focusing on the ceiling panels. He shifted his gaze to Chirin. The Deveri commander stood dripping seawater onto the deck, the azure glow of his pits dimming from the physical drain. "You stepped outside the hull," Sutton rasped. "I applied my density," Chirin said, locking his knees to steady his posture. "You required leverage. I served as a fulcrum." Sutton uncurled his left fingers. The blue calcified node rested in his palm. He clamped the stalks of fibrous vegetation tightly beneath his right elbow. Blythe lifted the node, the blue light catching her cheekbones. "You secured the catalyst." Blythe moved for the engineering access hatch. "Nemi, track his vitals. Chirin, detach the transmitter buoy from the dorsal mount and load it into the exhaust tube. We assemble the cannon." Sutton pushed upright, coughing a spray of brine onto the deck. He stripped off the weighted atmospheric suit, leaving the heavy boots on the deck plates. He pulled the pile of fibrous stalks into his lap, gripping a single vine and pulling hard. The fiber held taut. "Nemi," Sutton said. "Sit down." Nemi knelt across from him. "Specify your requirement." "This vessel breaches when the reactor fires," Sutton said. He took a pair of stalks and crossed them over his palm. "Upon hull rupture, we enter the water. We need bindings to connect us. I will show you how to weave." Sutton crossed the thick fibers, looping the ends through the gaps to build friction. Nemi tracked his knuckles, then selected a couple of loose stalks. She duplicated the sequence, braiding the vegetation into a solid tether. She stripped a foam cushion from a nearby shock seat, lashed the cord around it, and secured the opposite end to her belt. Chirin pressed one heavy hand onto the cushion. It sank almost flat. "Insufficient lift from my mass," he said. "Nemi has a better chance with it. I still load the buoy." Below deck, Blythe slotted the node into the primary ignition chamber's external relay bracket. She sealed the main housing, then opened the ocean intake valves, routing the flow into the titanium cooling jacket. "Intake complete," Blythe called over the comms. "Coolant line sealed. Stand by ignition." Blythe raised a spanner and struck the calcified node protruding edge. The mechanical impact discharged an arc of blue voltage across the gap. The fusion cycle caught. The reactor engaged with a low-frequency hum that vibrated the deck plates. Internal core temperature spiked. The trapped seawater hit the cooling jacket's superheating metal walls. The hull resonated with the unbroken roar of flash-boiling liquid, transitioning to high-pressure vapor. The benthic star's frame buckled. The deck plates beneath Sutton's boots radiated heat. The metal bulkhead shuttered. "Vapor expansion peaks," Blythe said, climbing the ladder into the command cabin and moving to the release console. "Jacket holds, but the hull's structural limits approach failure. Secure yourselves." Chirin and Nemi secured themselves in the rear dual shock seats, locking the heavy chest restraints. Chirin clamped a hand over Nemi's shoulder. Sutton and Blythe strapped into the forward crash webbing beside the release console. Blythe tracked the primary pressure gauge on her tablet. The digital needle climbed. 1200 psi, 3400, 5600. The readout flashed red. The deck plating bolts sheared from their threads, pinging against the bulkheads. "Red line," Blythe said, throwing the manual release lever. "Payload away!" The valve connecting the cooling jacket to the main exhaust tube opened. Vapor expelled into the exhaust tube's confined space, striking the communication buoy's base. The recoil drove the benthic star downward, pushing the damaged hull beneath the swells. The transmitter payload cleared the ship, riding a vertical pillar of vapor. Through the overhead viewport, the crew tracked the metal cylinder punching into the sky. It broke the piezoelectrical storm layer, generating a ring of blue electric discharge as it breached the atmospheric ceiling. The payload reached the upper atmosphere, clearing the interference field. Blythe traced the telemetry streams on a tablet. "Transmitter clear! Automated systems online!" The screen flashed green. "Distress package away," Blythe said, dropping the tablet to her lap. "Broadcasting coordinates to the orbital relay. Signal verified." The launch succeeded. The buoy's altitude carried the distress signal above the interference field. While the steam pillar punched a temporary gap through the squall overhead, the steam pressure within the reactor depleted. The resulting vacuum inside the cooling jacket buckled the titanium walls inward. The kinetic recoil from the launch finished severing the weakened lower hull framing. The bulkheads split. The command cabin deck tore away. The sea surged upward, filling the shattered cabin. The cold tide struck. The current ripped Sutton from his torn crash webbing, tumbling him through the wreckage. Jagged hull plating and loose circuitry spun past him as the emergency strobe shorted out. Sutton aligned his body, kicking his legs toward the surface current. He broke the waves, inhaling the cold air and clearing the brine from his eyes. Blythe breached a meter away, clinging to a buoyant section of internal thermal shielding. The foam insulation held the plating atop the swell. "Sutton," she called over the wind. "Secure yourself to the foam." Sutton swam over, gripping the shield's edge and scanning the debris field. Nemi breached the surface, paddling her arms while anchored to the float cushion via the braided tether. The woven vegetation kept her cranial ridges above the water. "Position on Turin?" Sutton asked. Nemi checked the water blower. "He released the wreckage." "He sinks." Sutton inhaled, filling his lungs, grabbed a loose shock seat cushion from the debris field, and angled his body downward. He kicked his legs, driving back under the surface and navigating past the sinking wreckage. 12 meters down, he spotted the glowing azure pits. Turin plummeted toward the floor, locked in instinctual stasis with his arms pinned to his sides. Sutton streamlined his posture, dropping fast enough to intercept the Deviri. Sutton caught Turin from behind, wrapping his arms around the broad chest, and jammed the buoyant cushion beneath the Deviri's harness. The added lift checked Turin's descent, giving Sutton something to fight against. Sutton locked his grip, recruited the muscles in his core, and kicked his legs in a continuous, powerful stroke. The compression squeezed his ribs, his lungs burning through the stored oxygen. Combined with the foam's buoyancy, he countered the density, forcing their trajectory upward. He kicked toward the surface's shifting light. Spots clustered. He kicked toward the surface's shifting light, spots clustering at the edges of his vision. Sutton broke the surface. He exhaled, pulling fresh air into his chest, and hauled Turin to the thermal shielding. Blythe grabbed the commander's arm, and together they pulled his mass onto the foam plating center. Sutton rested his arms on the shield's edge. Nemi pedaled a cushion over to the raft, gripping the side to stabilize their cluster. The benthic star remnants settled onto the sea floor, leaving the crew atop the debris. The steam pillar left a temporary breach through the weather cell, disrupting the interference field directly above. The sky cleared through the gap, exposing the starfield. The surface wind dropped, leaving only the slowly rolling swells. Turin sat in the raft's center, seawater running off his hide. A tremor ran through his shoulders, thermal shock affecting his dense biology. He checked the foam shielding supporting his weight, then looked at Sutton. The commander tilted his head. "I note," Turin said. his syllables crisped. The oceanic view proves adequate from this elevation. Blythe stared at him, then let out a sharp laugh. Nemi joined in, emitting a series of clicking vocalizations. Sutton leaned his head back against the foam, riding the swell's rise and fall. A sweeping shadow crossed the water. Searchlights cut across the surface. An orbital retrieval carrier descended through the gap in the squall, thrusters humming as it locked onto their coordinates. Sutton laughed, reaching over to grip Turin's shoulder. Turin looked at the hand resting on his dermis. The rigid lines of his jaw relaxed. The humans leveraged displacement to float. They broke stone for a spark, piped a reactor into a cannon, and braided kelp into a tether. The surface mechanics proved adaptable.